The morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of the Georgia State Capitol building as Zara Jackson approached the imposing structure. Her heels clicked rhythmically against the concrete, each step deliberate and purposeful. At 38, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned her place through years of meticulous work and unwavering dedication. Her dark business suit was impeccably tailored, her briefcase leather and well-worn from countless meetings and presentations. Zara had been the state auditor for 3 years now, a position she had fought hard to attain and worked even harder to excel in. Her reputation for thoroughness and integrity had earned her respect across party lines, though it had also made her enemies among those who preferred their financial dealings to remain in the shadows. Today was no different from any other she had been called to investigate irregularities in the city's police department budget, and her preliminary findings had already raised several red flags. As she climbed the steps, her mind was focused on the task ahead. The numbers didn't lie, and what she had discovered in her initial review suggested a pattern of financial misconduct that went deeper than anyone suspected. She had requested additional documentation from the police department, but her calls had been met with delays and excuses. That was why she was here today to get the records herself. Officer Brian Stilinski sat in his patrol car across the street from the Capitol building, his eyes fixed on the woman ascending the steps. He had been watching her for the past 10 minutes, his jaw clenched in frustration. Brian was a 15-year veteran of the force, a man who had grown comfortable with the way things worked in their department. He had heard through the grapevine about some auditor poking around their finances, asking uncomfortable questions about overtime payments and equipment purchases. Brian wasn't particularly bright, but he was cunning in the way that men who abuse their power often are. He had benefited from the loose oversight that had allowed certain officers to pad their paychecks and had no interest in seeing that system dismantled. When his sergeant had mentioned that the state auditor was a young black woman, Brian's prejudices had immediately kicked in. In his mind, she was probably an affirmative action hire, someone who had gotten her position through quotas rather than merit. He watched as Zara paused at the top of the steps, checking something on her phone. Brian's radio crackled to life, but he ignored it. His attention was entirely focused on what he saw as an opportunity to intimidate someone he viewed as an outsider who didn't belong in a position of authority. Brian stepped out of his patrol car, adjusting his utility belt and straightening his shoulders. He was a large man, standing 6 feet 3 inches, with the kind of build that came from years of trying to compensate for his insecurities through physical intimidation. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished, and his expression carried the arrogance of someone who had never truly been held accountable for his actions. He crossed the street with purpose, his hand resting casually on his radio as if he were responding to some official business. In reality, he was operating entirely on his own initiative, driven by a toxic combination of racism, sexism, and fear of losing the corrupt system that had enriched him for years. Zara was scrolling through her emails when she heard heavy footsteps approaching. She looked up to see a police officer walking directly toward her, his expression stern and unwelcoming. Her instincts, honed by years of dealing with hostile witnesses and uncooperative officials, immediately went on alert. She had encountered enough resistance in her career to recognize when someone was approaching with confrontational intent. Officer Stilinski stopped directly in front of her, positioning himself to block her path to the building entrance. His stance was aggressive, designed to intimidate, and his eyes held a coldness that Zara recognized all too well. She had seen that look before from men who resented her authority and questioned her right to hold it. "Excuse me, miss," Brian said, his tone dripping with condescension. The word miss was delivered with particular emphasis, a deliberate choice to diminish her status. "I need to see some identification." Zara raised an eyebrow, her expression remaining calm despite the obvious provocation. "I'm sorry, officer, but what is this regarding?" "I'm simply entering a public building. Brian's jaw tightened at her composed response. He had expected her to be flustered, maybe even intimidated. Instead, she stood her ground with a poise that only irritated him further. "This is regarding suspicious activity," he said, his voice growing louder. "I've received reports about someone impersonating a government official." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Zara's eyes narrowed slightly, recognizing the tactic for what it was. She had dealt with similar attempts at intimidation before, though rarely so blatant and never in such a public setting. She could see pedestrians beginning to slow their pace as they passed, drawn by the unusual sight of a police officer confronting a professionally dressed woman on the Capitol steps. "I see," Zara said, her voice steady. "And what exactly makes you think I'm impersonating anyone?" Brian stepped closer, using his height advantage to loom over her. "Well, for starters, you don't look like any government official I've ever seen. And I've been hearing about some woman claiming to be the state auditor, going around trying to access police records without proper authorization." The words were loaded with implication, each one carefully chosen to suggest that her very presence was illegitimate. Zara felt the familiar burn of anger in her chest, but she had learned long ago to channel such emotions into cold, professional focus. This man was making a mistake that would cost him dearly, but she wouldn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. "I'm afraid there's been some confusion," Zara said, reaching slowly into her briefcase. "I am Zara Jackson, and I am indeed the state auditor for the state of Georgia." Brian scoffed, the sound loud enough to draw even more attention from passing pedestrians. "Right, and I'm the governor. Look, lady, I don't know what kind of scam you're running, but it ends here." He reached for his handcuffs, the metal clinking ominously as he pulled them from his belt. "You're under arrest for fraud and impersonating a public official." The crowd that had been gradually gathering now stopped entirely, phones coming out as people began to record what was clearly becoming an extraordinary confrontation. Zara remained perfectly still, allowing Brian to continue digging his own grave with each word and action. "Officer," she said, her voice carrying a note of warning that he was too arrogant to heed, "I strongly advise you to verify my identity before you do something you'll regret." Brian laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the Capitol building's stone facade. "Oh, I'm sure you've got some fake ID all ready to go. That's how you people operate, isn't it? All smoke and mirrors." The racial undertone in his words was unmistakable now, and the growing crowd began to murmur with disapproval. Several people were now actively recording the exchange, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. Zara slowly pulled her official identification from her briefcase, holding it out for Brian to examine. The credential was unmistakable, an official State of Georgia ID card with her photograph, title, and the state seal prominently displayed. Brian barely glanced at it before waving it away dismissively. "Anyone can fake one of those. I've seen plenty of forgeries in my time." "Then perhaps you should call your supervisor," Zara suggested, her tone remaining professional despite the obvious absurdity of the situation. "They can verify my credentials." "My supervisor?" Brian's voice rose to nearly a shout now. "I don't need to call anyone to deal with a fraud like you. You think you can just waltz up here with your fancy suit and your attitude and fool everyone into thinking you're someone important?" He moved to grab her arm, intent on placing her under arrest despite having no legal justification for doing so. It was at that moment that Lieutenant Greg Foster, who had been passing by on his way to a meeting inside the Capitol, recognized what was happening. Foster had been with the state police for over 20 years and had worked directly with the state auditor's office on multiple occasions. He knew Zara Jackson by sight and reputation, and he couldn't believe what he was witnessing. He quickly approached the scene, his face grim with the understanding of just how catastrophic this situation was about to become. "Officer Stilinski," Foster called out sharply, causing Brian to freeze mid-motion. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Brian turned, his face flushing as he recognized the lieutenant's authority. "Sir, I'm arresting this woman for fraud and impersonating a state official." Foster's expression darkened as he looked from Brian to Zara, who stood with quiet dignity despite the harassment she had endured. "Officer Stilinski, do you have any idea who you're talking to?" "Some con artist trying to pass herself off as the state auditor," Brian replied, though his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. Foster stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "That con artist is Zara Jackson, the actual state auditor for the state of Georgia. And you, Officer Stilinski, are about to face the consequences of the most public display of incompetence and prejudice I've witnessed in my entire career." The color drained from Brian's face as the reality of his situation began to dawn on him. The crowd around them had grown larger, and dozens of phones were now capturing every moment of his humiliation. He looked at Zara with new eyes, finally seeing past his prejudices to recognize the quiet authority he should have noticed from the beginning. Zara stepped forward, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. "Officer Stilinski, I believe you owe me an apology, and then you and I are going to have a very serious conversation about your department's budget irregularities." Brian's hands trembled as he put away his handcuffs, the weight of his mistake crushing down on him like a physical force. He had wanted to intimidate someone he viewed as beneath him, but instead, he had publicly humiliated himself in front of the one person who had the power to expose every corrupt practice his department had hidden for years. The morning sun continued to shine down on the Capitol steps, but for Officer Brian Stilinski, the day had just become very dark indeed. The aftermath of the confrontation on the Capitol steps rippled through the law enforcement community like a stone thrown into still water. Within hours, video footage of Officer Brian Stilinski attempting to arrest State Auditor Zara Jackson had spread across social media platforms, garnering thousands of views and comments. The embarrassment was not just personal for Brian, it was institutional, reflecting poorly on his entire department and raising questions about the culture of prejudice and incompetence that had allowed such an incident to occur. Lieutenant Greg Foster had immediately escorted Zara into the Capitol building after the confrontation, but the damage was already done. Brian stood on the steps in stunned silence, watching as his career and reputation crumbled around him. The crowd that had gathered to witness his humiliation began to disperse, but their phones had captured everything. There would be no covering this up, no spinning the narrative in his favor. Inside her temporary office within the Capitol complex, Zara Jackson sat across from Lieutenant Foster, her composure finally allowing her to process what had just occurred. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a cold anger that she channeled into professional determination. This incident wasn't just about one officer's prejudice, it was symptomatic of deeper problems within the system she was investigating. "Ms. Jackson, I cannot begin to express how sorry I am about what just happened," Foster said, his voice heavy with genuine remorse. "Officer Stilinski's behavior was completely unacceptable, and I assure you that disciplinary action will be swift and severe." Zara nodded, her fingers steepled in front of her as she considered her response. "Lieutenant, I appreciate your concern, but what happened out there is actually quite revealing. Officer Stilinski's assumption that I was committing fraud, his immediate dismissal of my credentials, his willingness to arrest me without proper cause, these aren't the actions of one rogue officer. They suggest a culture that has lost sight of both professional standards and basic human decency." Foster shifted uncomfortably in his chair, recognizing the truth in her words. "You're right, of course. The department has some serious issues that need to be addressed. Which brings us to why I'm here in the first place," Zara said, opening her briefcase and pulling out a thick folder filled with financial documents. "My preliminary audit of your department's budget has revealed some very interesting patterns that suggest the corruption goes far beyond one officer's attitude problem." She spread several sheets of paper across the desk, each one covered with columns of numbers and highlighted irregularities. Foster leaned forward, studying the documents with growing concern. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "These are overtime records for the past 2 years," Zara explained, pointing to specific entries. Notice anything unusual? Foster scanned the numbers, his frown deepening. These overtime claims seem excessive. Some officers are claiming more overtime hours than there are hours in a week. Exactly. And it gets worse. Zara pulled out another sheet. Cross-reference these overtime claims with the duty rosters I managed to obtain. You'll find that several officers were claiming overtime for shifts when they weren't even scheduled to work. The implications were staggering. Foster found himself looking at evidence of systematic fraud within his own organization, a web of corruption that had been hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and willful ignorance. "How much money are we talking about?" Foster asked, though he was afraid to hear the answer. "Conservative estimate? Over $2 million in fraudulent overtime claims over the past 5 years, Zara replied. And that's just what I've been able to identify so far. The deeper I dig, the more irregularities I find. Foster sat back in his chair, the weight of the revelation settling over him like a heavy blanket. He had dedicated his career to law enforcement, believing in the nobility of the profession and the importance of upholding justice. To discover that his colleagues had been systematically stealing from taxpayers was devastating. "What else have you found?" he asked quietly. Zara pulled out another set of documents, these focusing on equipment purchases and maintenance contracts. "Your department has been paying inflated prices for basic supplies, entering into service contracts with companies that don't actually provide services, and purchasing equipment that never seems to arrive." She pointed to specific line items that told a story of corruption and greed. "This contract for vehicle maintenance shows payments of $50,000 to a company that, according to my research, doesn't exist. The address listed is a vacant lot downtown." Foster studied the documents with growing horror. Each page revealed another layer of fraud, another example of public trust being violated for personal gain. The scope of the corruption was breathtaking in its audacity and scope. "Who else knows about this?" Foster asked. "At this point, just you and my immediate team," Zara replied. "But that's about to change. I have a meeting with the governor's office this afternoon, and I'll be presenting my preliminary findings to the state legislature's oversight committee next week." The mention of the governor's office seemed to jolt Foster into action. He understood the political implications of what Zara had discovered. When this information became public, heads would roll, careers would end, and the reputation of law enforcement in the state would suffer a devastating blow. "Ms. Jackson, what can we do to minimize the damage? I know that sounds self-serving, but there are good officers in our department who don't deserve to be painted with the same brush as these criminals." Zara appreciated his concern for innocent officers, but she had a job to do. "Lieutenant, my responsibility is to the taxpayers of this state and to the principle of accountability in government. The damage was done by the officers who chose to steal from the public, not by the auditor who uncovered their crimes." Foster nodded, understanding her position even as he dreaded the consequences. "What do you need from me?" "Full cooperation," Zara said simply. "I need access to all financial records, personnel files, and operational documents. No delays, no excuses, and no interference. And I need it starting today." "You'll have it," Foster promised. "But I should warn you that not everyone in the department is going to be as cooperative as I am. Some of these officers have a lot to lose, and desperate people do desperate things." The warning hung in the air between them, a reminder that Zara's investigation was about to make her some very dangerous enemies. But she had faced threats before, and she wouldn't be deterred by intimidation tactics. "I appreciate the warning, Lieutenant, but I didn't get this position by backing down from difficult situations. These officers may think they can scare me off, but they're about to learn otherwise." Meanwhile, across town in the police department's main precinct, word of the morning's incident was spreading like wildfire. Officers huddled in small groups, whispering about Brian Stalinsky's public humiliation and speculating about what it might mean for them. The smart ones were already reviewing their own records, looking for anything that might draw unwanted attention. Captain Robert Hayes sat in his office, door closed, as he furiously made phone calls to various contacts throughout the city. As one of the ringleaders of the corruption scheme, Hayes had the most to lose from Zara's investigation. He had used his position to orchestrate fraudulent contracts, approve false overtime claims, and facilitate the theft of public funds. His comfortable lifestyle, his expensive car, his boat, his vacation home in Florida all depended on the continuation of these illegal activities. "I don't care what it costs," Hayes said into his phone, his voice tight with desperation. "I need to know everything about this auditor woman. Her background, her methods, her weaknesses. There has to be something we can use against her." The person on the other end of the line seemed to be asking questions because Hayes paused before responding. "No, we can't just intimidate her like we usually do. Stilinski's little stunt this morning made sure of that. Now she's got public sympathy and political protection. We need to be smarter about this." Hayes ended the call and immediately dialed another number. He was activating a network of contacts that had served him well over the years, but he had never faced a threat quite like Zara Jackson. She wasn't some local politician who could be bought or intimidated. She was a professional auditor with the backing of the state government and, after this morning's incident, the support of public opinion. As Hayes plotted his response, he failed to notice that his assistant, Officer Tyrone Davis, was listening at the door. Davis was one of the few honest officers left in the department, a man who had watched with growing dismay as corruption became the norm rather than the exception. The morning's incident had been the final straw for him, and he was already planning to approach the state auditor's office with information of his own. Back at the Capitol, Zara was preparing for her afternoon meeting with the governor's representatives. She knew that the political ramifications of her findings would be significant, but she also knew that accountability was the only path forward. The system had failed, and it would take courage and determination to fix it. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. She opened it to find a simple message. "Be careful. You've made some powerful enemies today." Zara stared at the message for a moment, then deleted it. Threats came with the territory in her line of work, and she had learned long ago not to let them deter her from doing her job. If anything, they only confirmed that she was on the right track. The investigation was just beginning, but already the battle lines were being drawn. On one side stood those who profited from corruption and abuse of power. On the other stood those who believed in accountability, justice, and the rule of law. The confrontation on the Capitol steps had been just the opening shot in what promised to be a much larger war. Officer Tyrone Davis had never imagined that his career in law enforcement would lead him to this moment, sitting in a secure conference room at the state Capitol building, preparing to betray colleagues he had once considered brothers in blue. But the events of the morning, witnessing Brian Stilinski's racist confrontation with the state auditor, had crystallized years of mounting disgust with the corruption that permeated his department. Davis was a 12-year veteran, a man who had joined the force with genuine ideals about serving and protecting his community. Over the years, he had watched as those ideals were slowly eroded by a culture of greed and prejudice. He had been approached multiple times to participate in various schemes, but had always declined, earning him a reputation as someone who couldn't be trusted with the department's special arrangements. Now, as he sat across from Zara Jackson and her team of investigators, Davis felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief at finally being able to tell the truth about what he had witnessed, terror at the certain knowledge that his revelations would make him a marked man within his own department. "Officer Davis," Zara said, her voice gentle but professional, "I want you to know that your decision to come forward takes tremendous courage. Before we begin, I need to make sure you understand the potential consequences of what you're about to share." Davis nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Ma'am, after what I saw this morning, I couldn't stay silent anymore. Officer Stilinski's behavior was disgusting, but it wasn't surprising. It's part of a pattern that goes all the way to the top." Zara leaned forward, her pen poised over a legal pad. "Tell me about this pattern," For the next 2 hours, Davis laid out a comprehensive picture of corruption that surpassed even Zara's preliminary findings. He spoke of Captain Hayes's direct involvement in fraudulent contracts, describing meetings where Hayes had explicitly instructed officers on how to falsify reports and inflate overtime claims. He detailed a system where promotions were based not on merit but on willingness to participate in corrupt activities. The overtime scam is just the tip of the iceberg, Davis explained. They've got officers claiming to work security details that don't exist, filing reports for equipment that was never purchased, and taking kickbacks from towing companies for unnecessary vehicle impounds. Zara's assistant, taking detailed notes, looked up with concern. "Officer Davis, you're describing a criminal conspiracy that involves dozens of officers and potentially millions of dollars in theft." "Yes, ma'am, that's exactly what it is," Davis replied without hesitation. "And it's gotten worse over the years because nobody was watching. They started small, maybe padding a few hours here and there, but when nobody questioned it, they got bolder." Zara pulled out a photograph from her file. "Do you recognize this man?" Davis looked at the photo and nodded grimly. "That's Vincent Kozlov. He runs several shell companies that have city contracts. Problem is, most of those companies don't actually provide the services they're paid for. And Captain Hayes knows this. Hayes set it up. Kozlov kicks back 30% of every contract to Hayes and his inner circle. It's been going on for at least 5 years that I know of." The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. As Davis continued his testimony, painting a picture of systematic theft and abuse of power, Zara realized that her investigation was about to expose one of the largest municipal corruption scandals in the state's history. "Officer Davis, I have to ask why you never reported this before today." Davis was quiet for a long moment, the weight of years of moral compromise visible on his face. "I tried, once, early on. I went to internal affairs about some irregularities I'd noticed. The next day, I found myself assigned to the worst beat in the city, working double shifts with my fellow officers, forgetting to provide backup when I called for it." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "They made it clear that if I wanted to have a career, any kind of career, I needed to keep my mouth shut. So I did. I'm not proud of that, but I had a family to think about, bills to pay. I told myself that I was doing the right thing by not participating, but I realize now that staying silent made me complicit." Zara understood the impossible position Davis had been in. Speaking out against corruption from within was often career suicide, particularly in organizations with strong codes of silence. "What changed your mind?" "This morning. Watching Stilinski try to arrest you just for being black and successful, seeing the way he dismissed your credentials and assumed you were a criminal that wasn't law enforcement. That was just racism with a badge. And I realized that by staying silent about the corruption, I had enabled the culture that made Stilinski think his behavior was acceptable." The room fell silent as the implications of Davis's words settled over them. The corruption wasn't just about money, it was about power, privilege, and the belief that certain people were above the law and accountability. "What else can you tell me about the network?" Zara asked. Davis pulled out his phone, showing her a series of text messages. "They have a group chat they call The Family. It's where they coordinate their activities, share information about investigations, and plan their next moves." He scrolled through the messages, each one more damning than the last. There were discussions about how to manipulate overtime records, which judges could be counted on to be lenient with their arrests, and even explicit instructions on how to plant evidence when necessary. "My God," one of Zara's investigators whispered, "they're discussing evidence tampering like it's routine maintenance." "Because for them it is," Davis replied bitterly. "They've created their own little kingdom where they make the rules and everyone else suffers the consequences." Zara studied the messages with growing anger. The casual way these officers discussed breaking the law, violating citizens' rights, and stealing public money was breathtaking in its audacity. But it also provided her with the evidence she needed to build an ironclad case. "Officer Davis, would you be willing to testify about what you've shared with us today?" "Yes, ma'am. But I need protection for my family." Once this comes out, these people are going to want revenge, and they know where I live." "You'll have it," Zara promised. "We're already coordinating with the FBI and the state police to ensure your safety." As the interview concluded, Davis felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. He had finally done the right thing, but he knew that the path ahead would be difficult and dangerous. These weren't ordinary criminals he was exposing. These were sworn law enforcement officers with access to weapons, confidential information, and a network of corrupt contacts throughout the city. Meanwhile, back at the police station, Captain Hayes was growing increasingly agitated. He had been trying to reach Officer Davis all day, but Davis wasn't answering his phone or responding to radio calls. Hayes had noticed Davis's absence from the morning briefing, and combined with his failure to respond to communications, it was raising red flags. "Sullivan," Hayes called out to one of his trusted officers, "have you seen Davis today?" Officer Scott Murphy, one of Hayes's most reliable accomplices, shook his head. "Not since yesterday. Want me to do a welfare check at his house?" Hayes considered this, but something told him that Davis's absence wasn't due to illness or family emergency. The timing was too suspicious, coming so soon after the morning's incident with the state auditor. "No, not yet, but keep trying to reach him, and if you see him around town, let me know immediately." Hayes returned to his office and closed the door, his paranoia growing by the hour. He had built his corrupt empire by being smart, cautious, and ruthless when necessary. Now, faced with the first real threat to his operation in years, he was struggling to maintain control. He opened his desk drawer and pulled out a burner phone, one of several he kept for communications that couldn't be traced back to him. He dialed a number he had hoped never to use. "It's Hayes," he said when the call was answered. "We have a problem, a big one." The voice on the other end was cold and professional. "What kind of problem?" "The state auditor is digging into our finances, and I think we may have a leak inside the department. I need options." "Options cost money. How much is your problem worth to you?" Hayes thought about his vacation home, his boat, his comfortable lifestyle, all the things he stood to lose if the investigation continued. "Whatever it takes. Just make the problem go away." The call ended without another word, but Hayes knew that darker forces had been set in motion. He had crossed a line that even he had avoided until now, but desperate times called for desperate measures. As the sun set over the city, battle lines were being drawn for a conflict that would determine not just the fate of a few corrupt officers, but the very soul of law enforcement in the community. On one side stood those who believed that badges and uniforms gave them the right to lie, steal, and abuse their power. On the other stood those who believed that no one, regardless of their position, was above the law. The war for accountability was about to begin in earnest. The secure conference room in the FBI field office buzzed with quiet intensity as federal agents, state investigators, and prosecutors coordinated what had rapidly become one of the most complex corruption investigations in recent memory. Zara Jackson sat at the head of the table, her laptop open to a presentation that outlined the full scope of the criminal conspiracy she had uncovered within the police department. Special Agent Rebecca Stone, the FBI's lead investigator on the case, studied the financial records with the practiced eye of someone who had spent years following money trails through elaborate criminal enterprises. "Ms. Jackson, what you've uncovered here goes beyond simple embezzlement. This is a racketeering operation." The room fell silent as the implications of Stone's assessment sank in. RICO charges carried severe penalties and would allow federal prosecutors to target the entire criminal organization, not just individual actors. "How confident are we in Officer Davis's testimony?" asked Assistant District Attorney Michael Freeman, a prosecutorial veteran who had been brought in to handle the state-level charges. "Very confident," Zara replied, "but more importantly, his testimony has given us the roadmap we need to gather corroborating evidence. We know where to look now and what we're looking for." Agent Stone nodded in agreement. "We've already begun surveillance on the key players, and we're coordinating with the state police to ensure that local officers can't interfere with the investigation." The investigation had expanded far beyond Zara's original audit. What had started as a routine examination of budget irregularities had revealed a criminal conspiracy that involved not just police officers but city contractors, local politicians, and even members of the judiciary who had been compromised through bribes and kickbacks. "What's our timeline?" Freeman asked. "We need to move fast," Stone replied. "Word is already spreading that we're asking questions. The longer we wait, the more evidence they can destroy, and the more dangerous it becomes for our witnesses." Zara's phone buzzed with an incoming call from an unknown number. She glanced at it briefly before declining the call, but not before noting that it was the fifth such call she had received that day. Someone was very interested in talking to her. "Are you still receiving threats?" Agent Stone asked, having noticed the pattern. "Nothing explicit," Zara replied. "Mostly hang-ups and vague messages warning me to be careful, but the volume is increasing. We're monitoring your communications and maintaining surveillance on your home and office," Stone assured her. "These people are dangerous, but they're not stupid enough to directly threaten a state official. It would only make things worse for them." What Stone didn't mention was that the FBI had intercepted several much more explicit threats, including discussions among the corrupt officers about eliminating the problem that Zara represented. The federal agents were taking these threats very seriously, even if they weren't sharing the details with their target. Back at the police station, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically since the morning's incident. Officers who had once joked openly about their various schemes now spoke in hushed tones, afraid that any casual comment might be overheard and reported. The usual camaraderie had been replaced by suspicion and paranoia. Captain Hayes had called an emergency meeting of his inner circle, the core group of officers who had profited most from their criminal activities. They gathered in his office after hours, the blinds drawn and the door locked. "Gentlemen," Hayes began, his voice tense, "we have a situation. The state auditor's investigation is moving faster than we anticipated, and I have reason to believe that someone inside our organization is cooperating with them." The officers exchanged nervous glances. They had all built comfortable lives on the proceeds of their crimes, and the thought of losing everything to federal prosecution was terrifying. "Who do you think it is?" asked Sergeant Tom Bradley, one of Hayes's most trusted lieutenants. "I'm not sure yet, but Davis has been missing for 2 days now, and he's not responding to any attempts at contact. Given his history of refusing to participate in our activities, he's the most likely candidate." The room fell silent as the officers contemplated the implications of having a cooperating witness within their ranks. They all knew that Davis had access to enough information to bring down their entire operation. "What do we do about it?" asked another officer. Hayes leaned back in his chair, his expression cold. "We're exploring all of our options, but for now I need everyone to review their records and make sure there's nothing that can directly tie you to any irregularities. Clean house, if you know what I mean." The officers understood the coded language. They needed to destroy evidence, create alibis, and prepare for the possibility of federal charges. But they also understood that their leader was considering more drastic measures to protect their criminal enterprise. Unknown to them, their conversation was being recorded by surveillance equipment that had been installed by the FBI earlier that day. Every word was being captured and would be used as evidence in the prosecutions that were sure to follow. Officer Tyrone Davis sat in a safe house across town, reviewing documents with federal agents as they prepared for the raids that would take place within days. The decision to cooperate with the investigation had been difficult, but watching Brian Stalinsky's racist confrontation with Zara Jackson had made it clear that the corruption in his department wasn't just about money, it was about power and the belief that certain people deserved to be above the law. Davis had been providing investigators with detailed information about the department's criminal activities for 3 days now, helping them understand not just what crimes had been committed, but how the entire system had been corrupted to enable them. His inside knowledge was proving invaluable in building cases that would be impossible to defend against. Officer Davis, Agent Stone said, looking up from a stack of financial records. Can you walk us through how the overtime fraud typically worked? Davis nodded, pulling out a diagram he had sketched showing the various participants in the scheme. It was pretty sophisticated, actually. Hayes would create fake security details, usually for events that didn't exist or didn't require police presence. Then he'd assign officers to these phantom details, and they'd submit overtime claims for hours they never worked. He pointed to different parts of his diagram. The beauty of it, from their perspective, was that it involved multiple layers of falsification. The initial work order was fake, the timesheets were fake, and the supervisory approval was fake. By the time it reached payroll, it looked completely legitimate. Agent Stone studied the diagram with growing appreciation for the complexity of the fraud. How much money could an officer make from this in a typical month? Depends on their rank and how many fake details they were assigned to, Davis replied. But some of the senior officers were pulling in an extra $3,000 to $4,000 a month. Over a year, that's a significant amount of money. The federal agents were building their case methodically, using Davis's information to identify patterns in the financial records that would have been impossible to spot without inside knowledge. Each piece of evidence corroborated his testimony and strengthened their ability to prosecute the entire criminal organization. Meanwhile, Zara Jackson was dealing with increasing pressure from multiple directions. Politicians who had relationships with the corrupt officers were making subtle inquiries about the scope of her investigation. Business leaders whose companies had benefited from fraudulent contracts were expressing concern about the economic impact of her findings. Even some community leaders were worried about the effect that mass prosecutions might have on public trust in law enforcement. But Zara remained focused on her core mission, ensuring that taxpayer money was properly accounted for and that public officials were held to the highest standards of integrity. She had built her career on the principle that no one was above scrutiny, and she wasn't about to compromise that principle now, regardless of the political pressure. Her phone rang as she was reviewing the latest batch of evidence gathered by the FBI. The caller ID showed it was Governor Patricia Mills's chief of staff. "Zara, I hope you're doing well after this morning's unfortunate incident," the chief of staff said, his tone carefully measured. "The governor wanted me to check in and see how your investigation is progressing." Zara recognized the diplomatic language for what it was, an attempt to gauge how much political damage the investigation might cause. "The investigation is proceeding according to standard protocols," she replied carefully. "I'll be presenting my preliminary findings to the appropriate oversight committees within the next week." Of course. "I'm sure you understand that the governor is concerned about maintaining public confidence in our law enforcement institutions. Perhaps there's a way to address these issues without creating unnecessary controversy." The suggestion hung in the air like a loaded question. Zara understood that she was being asked to consider whether some form of quiet resolution might be preferable to public prosecution and the inevitable media circus that would follow. "Sir, I appreciate the governor's concerns, but my responsibility is to ensure accountability and transparency in the use of public funds. If crimes have been committed, they need to be prosecuted through the appropriate channels." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I understand your position, Zara. Just remember that sometimes the greater good requires us to consider the broader implications of our actions." After ending the call, Zara sat quietly in her office, considering the conversation. She knew that pressure would continue to mount as the investigation progressed, and that some of it would come from people she respected and whose opinions she valued. But she also knew that backing down now would send a message that corruption would be tolerated as long as it didn't create political embarrassment. Her contemplation was interrupted by a knock on her door. Agent Stone entered, her expression grim. "We have a problem," Stone said without preamble. "Our surveillance team has picked up chatter suggesting that Captain Hayes and his associates are planning something desperate. We think they may be considering eliminating key witnesses." Zara felt a chill run down her spine. She had expected threats and intimidation, but the possibility of violence added a new dimension of danger to the situation. "How credible is this intelligence?" she asked. The decision to accelerate the timeline meant that some evidence gathering would be incomplete, but the safety of witnesses took priority over building the perfect case. The FBI had enough evidence to secure convictions on the major charges, and additional evidence could be gathered after the arrests. "What do you need from me?" Zara asked. "Stay visible and maintain your normal routine," Stone said. "We don't want them to know that we're aware of their plans, but you'll have additional security starting immediately." As Stone left, Zara realized that the investigation had reached a critical turning point. Tomorrow morning, the corrupt officers who had thought themselves untouchable would learn that no one was above the law. But tonight, she had to trust that the federal agents protecting her would keep her safe from people who had already demonstrated their willingness to abuse their power in the most fundamental ways. The storm was about to break, and when it did, the resulting thunder would be heard throughout the state. Dawn was breaking over the city as FBI agents and state police officers took their positions around multiple locations throughout the metropolitan area. The coordinated operation, codenamed Clean House, represented months of investigation compressed into a single morning of decisive action. At the command center, Agent Stone monitored communications from dozens of arrest teams as they prepared to simultaneously execute warrants on 37 defendants. Zara Jackson stood in the observation room, watching as the final preparations were made. She had insisted on being present for the arrests, despite the security concerns. These men had tried to intimidate her, threatened her, and questioned her right to hold them accountable. She wanted to see justice served with her own eyes. "Teams are in position," came the voice over the radio. "Execute on my mark." Stone looked at her watch. It was exactly 6 a.m. Mark. Across the city, doors were being knocked down, and search warrants were being executed with military precision. The corrupt officers who had spent years believing themselves untouchable were being rudely awakened to a new reality. At Captain Hayes's suburban home, a dozen agents surrounded the property before dawn. Hayes had always prided himself on being prepared for any eventuality, but nothing had prepared him for the sight of federal agents in tactical gear streaming onto his perfectly manicured lawn. He answered the door in his bathrobe, his face a mask of shock and disbelief as Agent Stone read him his rights. "Robert Hayes, you are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and violation of civil rights under color of law." Hayes's wife watched in horror from the stairway as her husband was handcuffed and led away. The comfortable life they had built on stolen money was crashing down around them, and there would be no easy way to rebuild it. Similar scenes were playing out across the city as officers who had spent their careers breaking the law found themselves on the wrong side of handcuffs. Brian Stilinski, still reeling from his humiliating confrontation with Zara Jackson just days earlier, was arrested at his apartment. The man who had questioned Zara's credentials and assumed she was a criminal now faced federal charges that could send him to prison for decades. Officer Scott Murphy, Hayes's trusted lieutenant, was taken into custody at the police station itself, arrested in front of his colleagues as he reported for the morning shift. The symbolism was intentional. The FBI wanted everyone in the department to understand that the culture of corruption was ending. By 8 a.m., the operation was complete. 37 individuals were in federal custody, and search teams had seized millions of dollars in assets, including Hayes's boat, several expensive cars, and multiple properties that had been purchased with stolen money. The police station was in chaos. Officers who had not been arrested were trying to distance themselves from their corrupt colleagues, while department administrators scrambled to maintain basic operations with so many senior personnel suddenly absent. Lieutenant Greg Foster, who had intervened during Brian Stilinski's attempted arrest of Zara Jackson, found himself thrust into temporary command of a department that had been gutted by the federal operation. He called an emergency meeting of the remaining officers, many of whom were struggling to process what had happened. "I know this morning has been shocking for all of us," Foster began, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "But I want to make something clear. This department will continue to serve and protect this community. The actions of these individuals do not define us as an organization. One of the younger officers raised his hand. Lieutenant, how do we rebuild trust with the community after something like this? Foster paused, considering the question carefully. We rebuild trust by doing our jobs with integrity, by being transparent about what went wrong, and by proving through our actions that we are worthy of the public's confidence. It won't be easy and it won't happen overnight, but it's the only path forward. Meanwhile, at the federal courthouse, the arrested officers were being processed and arraigned. The scope of the charges was staggering: conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, civil rights violations, and racketeering. Bail was set at amounts that reflected the seriousness of the crimes and the flight risk posed by the defendants. Captain Hayes, representing himself as the leader of the criminal organization, faced the most severe charges. As he sat in the defendant's chair, listening to the prosecutor outline the government's case against him, the full weight of his situation became clear. He was looking at potential sentences that would keep him in federal prison for the rest of his life. Brian Stilinski, meanwhile, was learning that his racist confrontation with Zara Jackson had become a key piece of evidence in the government's case. The incident demonstrated the culture of prejudice and abuse that had enabled the corruption to flourish unchecked. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said during Stilinski's arraignment, "the defendant's attempt to arrest State Auditor Jackson without cause demonstrates the contempt for law and authority that characterized this criminal conspiracy. The defendant believed that his badge gave him the right to harass and intimidate a state official simply because she was investigating financial irregularities." Stilinski's lawyer tried to minimize the incident, arguing that it was a case of mistaken identity rather than evidence of broader corruption. But the argument fell flat in the face of the overwhelming evidence that had been gathered against his client. As the arraignments continued throughout the day, the local media was having a field day. The story had everything: corruption, racism, federal arrests, and a dramatic confrontation on the steps of the state capitol. News crews camped outside the courthouse, the police station, and anywhere else they might catch a glimpse of the unfolding drama. Zara Jackson held a press conference that afternoon, standing at a podium surrounded by FBI agents and state prosecutors. She had prepared carefully for this moment, knowing that her words would be scrutinized and that she needed to strike the right tone. "The arrests that took place this morning represent a victory for accountability and the rule of law," she began, her voice clear and confident. "No one, regardless of their position or authority, is above the law. The officers who were arrested today betrayed their oath to serve and protect, and they will be held accountable for their crimes." She paused, looking directly into the cameras. "But this investigation also represents something more important. It shows that our system of checks and balances works. When public officials abuse their authority, there are mechanisms in place to hold them accountable. The auditing process exists precisely to prevent and expose this kind of corruption." A reporter raised her hand. "Miss Jackson, do you believe that Officer Stilinski's attempt to arrest you was motivated by racial prejudice?" Had expected this question and had prepared her response carefully. "I believe that Officer Stilinski's actions reflected a culture within the police department that had lost sight of basic professional standards and respect for the rule of law. Whether his specific motivation was racial prejudice, gender bias, or simple arrogance is less important than the fact that he felt entitled to question my credentials and authority without cause." Another reporter followed up. "What message do you hope this sends to other government agencies?" "The message is simple. Accountability is not negotiable. Whether you're a police officer, a city contractor, or an elected official, if you steal from taxpayers or abuse your authority, you will be caught and you will be prosecuted. The systems we have in place to ensure transparency and accountability are not suggestions, they are requirements." As the press conference concluded, Zara felt a sense of satisfaction that had been building since the morning's arrests. The confrontation on the Capitol steps, which had seemed so humiliating and infuriating at the time, had ultimately led to the exposure of a massive criminal conspiracy. Officer Tyrone Davis, watching the press conference from the FBI safe house, felt his own mixture of relief and apprehension. He had done the right thing by coming forward, but he knew that his decision to cooperate would have consequences that would follow him for years to come. Some would see him as a hero who exposed corruption. Others would view him as a traitor who betrayed his fellow officers. But as he watched Zara Jackson speak about accountability and the rule of law, Davis knew that his decision had been correct. The badge he wore was supposed to represent justice and integrity, not corruption and prejudice. By helping to expose the criminals who had perverted those ideals, he had honored the true meaning of law enforcement. The arrests marked the end of one phase of the investigation, but the legal proceedings would continue for months or even years. Trials would be held, sentences would be imposed, and the full extent of the corruption would be laid bare for public examination. But the immediate impact was clear. A culture of corruption that had flourished in the shadows had been dragged into the light, and those who had profited from it were now facing the consequences of their actions. The system had worked, accountability had been enforced, and justice was being served. 6 months after the dramatic arrests that had shocked the city, the federal courthouse had become the center of intense public attention as the corruption trials began. The government had decided to prosecute the cases in groups, starting with the most serious offenders and working their way down to the lesser participants. Captain Robert Hayes, as the alleged ringleader, would face trial first, followed by his inner circle of co-conspirators. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and law enforcement officials from other agencies who wanted to see how justice would be served. Zara Jackson sat in the gallery, her presence a constant reminder of how the investigation had begun with a single racist confrontation that had exposed a massive criminal conspiracy. Hayes had hired one of the city's most expensive defense attorneys, a man known for his ability to create reasonable doubt even in seemingly hopeless cases. But as the prosecution began presenting its evidence, it became clear that the government's case was overwhelming in its scope and detail. Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen stood before the jury, a stack of documents in her hands that represented years of systematic theft and corruption. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, over the next several weeks, you will hear evidence of a criminal conspiracy that stole millions of dollars from the taxpayers of this city. The defendant, Captain Robert Hayes, didn't just participate in this conspiracy, he organized it and profited from it. Chen walked over to a large display board that showed the organizational structure of the corrupt network. The evidence will show that Captain Hayes created a criminal enterprise within the police department, where promotions were based not on merit but on willingness to participate in illegal activities, where public money was diverted from its intended purpose to line the pockets of corrupt officers, where the badge and uniform became tools of personal enrichment rather than symbols of public service. The defense attorney, Marcus Webb, tried to paint Hayes as a scapegoat, a career officer who had been caught up in a system that encouraged corner-cutting and creative accounting. My client served this community for 23 years, Webb argued. He rose through the ranks based on his dedication and competence. The government wants you to believe that he suddenly became a criminal mastermind, but the evidence will show that he was simply following practices that had been in place long before he ever held a position of authority. But as the prosecution began calling witnesses, Webb's strategy quickly fell apart. Officer Tyrone Davis took the stand first, his testimony providing a roadmap through the complex financial schemes that Hayes had orchestrated. Captain Hayes made it very clear that participation in these activities was not optional, Davis testified. his voice steady despite the hostile stares from some spectators who viewed him as a traitor. He told me directly that officers who didn't play ball would find their careers stalled and their work assignments made as unpleasant as possible. The prosecutor guided Davis through the various elements of the conspiracy, from the fake overtime details to the fraudulent equipment purchases. With each answer, Davis painted a picture of systematic corruption that went far beyond simple accounting errors or procedural shortcuts. "Officer Davis," Chen said, "did Captain Hayes ever explain why he felt entitled to take this money?" Davis nodded. "He said that police officers were underpaid for the risks they took and that the city owed them more than they were willing to pay. He said we were just taking what we deserved." The defense attorney's cross-examination was aggressive, attempting to portray Davis as an unreliable witness who was cooperating with the government only to save himself from prosecution. But Davis had prepared for these attacks, and his answers remained consistent and credible. "Isn't it true, Officer Davis, that you're only testifying against my client because the FBI threatened to prosecute you as well?" "No, sir," Davis replied firmly. "I'm testifying because what we did was wrong, and the people of this city deserve to know the truth about how their money was stolen." The next witness was Vincent Kozlov, the contractor who had operated the shell companies that received fraudulent payments from the city. Kozlov had agreed to cooperate with the government in exchange for a reduced sentence, and his testimony provided details about how the money laundering operation had worked. "Captain Hayes approached me about 3 years ago," Kozlov testified, his accent thick but his words clear. "He said he had some city contracts that needed to be handled discreetly. I would submit bills for services that were never provided, and when the city paid, I would keep 30% and give the rest back to Hayes and his people." The prosecutor showed the jury copies of invoices for maintenance work that was never performed, security services that were never provided, and equipment that was never delivered. The paper trail was extensive and damning, showing a systematic pattern of theft that had continued for years. During a break in the proceedings, Zara Jackson was approached by several reporters who wanted her reaction to the testimony. She had been careful to avoid commenting on the ongoing trial, but the evidence being presented vindicated everything she had suspected during her initial audit. "The testimony we're hearing confirms what financial audits had suggested," she said carefully. "There were systematic irregularities that couldn't be explained by simple accounting errors or procedural mistakes. The evidence being presented in court shows that these irregularities were the result of deliberate criminal activity." Back in the courtroom, the prosecution continued to build its case with methodical precision. FBI agents testified about their surveillance of the defendants, playing recordings of conversations where Hayes and his co-conspirators discussed their criminal activities with casual indifference to the law. One particularly damaging recording captured Hayes talking about Officer Davis's reluctance to participate in the corruption. "Davis thinks he's better than us," Hayes could be heard saying, "but he'll come around when he realizes that this is how things work around here. Everyone has a choice. They can be part of the team, or they can find themselves working the worst beats in the city." The recording demonstrated not only Hayes's role as the leader of the conspiracy, but also his willingness to use his authority to intimidate officers who might expose the corruption. As the first week of testimony concluded, it was clear that the government had built an overwhelming case against Hayes. The defense had been unable to create meaningful doubt about his guilt, and several jurors were visibly disturbed by the evidence of systematic theft and abuse of power. Brian Stalinsky's trial was scheduled to begin the following month, and his attorney was already signaling that he might be willing to accept a plea bargain rather than face the certainty of conviction at trial. The racist confrontation with Zara Jackson had become a symbol of the arrogance and prejudice that had enabled the corruption to flourish, and it would be difficult to convince a jury that his actions were those of a good officer who had simply made a mistake. Meanwhile, the police department was struggling to rebuild its reputation and operational effectiveness. Lieutenant Foster had been promoted to captain and was working to implement new oversight procedures and accountability measures. But the damage to community trust was severe, and it would take years of consistent ethical behavior to repair the relationship between the police and the people they served. Community leaders were calling for comprehensive police reform, including civilian oversight of department finances and mandatory anti-corruption training for all officers. The City Council had approved funding for an independent Inspector General position, and Zara Jackson had been asked to help design the auditing procedures that would prevent future corruption. As Hayes sat in the defendant's chair, listening to witness after witness describe his criminal activities, the reality of his situation was becoming undeniable. The comfortable life he had built on stolen money was over, and he faced the prospect of spending the rest of his life in federal prison. The trial would continue for several more weeks, but the outcome was no longer in serious doubt. The evidence was too overwhelming, the witnesses too credible, and the pattern of behavior too clear to ignore. Justice would be served, accountability would be enforced, and the message would be sent that no one, regardless of their position or authority, was above the law. The verdict came on a gray Thursday morning in late October, exactly 8 months after Brian Stilinski had attempted to arrest Zara Jackson on the steps of the state capitol. The jury had deliberated for only 6 hours before reaching their decision, a remarkably short time considering the complexity of the charges against Captain Robert Hayes. As the foreman stood to read the verdict, the packed courtroom fell into absolute silence. Hayes sat rigidly in his chair, his expensive suit unable to mask the fear and desperation that had consumed him over the past months. His wife sat in the front row behind the defense table, her face pale and drawn from months of stress and public humiliation. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Robert Hayes, guilty on all counts." The words echoed through the courtroom like a thunderclap. Hayes closed his eyes and slumped slightly in his chair as the reality of his conviction settled over him. Guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud. Guilty of money laundering. Guilty of racketeering. Guilty of civil rights violations under color of law. Each count carried significant prison time, and together they ensured that Hayes would spend the remainder of his life behind bars. Zara Jackson felt a profound sense of satisfaction as she watched the man who had orchestrated years of systematic theft finally face justice. The investigation that had begun with a racist confrontation had exposed corruption that went far deeper than anyone had imagined. And now that corruption was being held accountable in the most public way possible. Judge Patricia Morrison, a federal jurist known for her no-nonsense approach to sentencing, scheduled Hayes' punishment phase for the following month. But legal observers were already predicting that he would receive the maximum sentence allowed under federal guidelines. As Hayes was led away in handcuffs, his attorney made a brief statement to the assembled media. "We are disappointed in the verdict and will be appealing this decision. Captain Hayes dedicated his career to law enforcement and deserves better than to be made a scapegoat for systemic problems that existed long before he held a position of authority." But the appeal rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence that had been presented during the trial. The jury had heard weeks of testimony detailing Hayes' central role in the criminal conspiracy, and they had been convinced beyond any reasonable doubt of his guilt. The conviction sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the state. Police departments that had operated with minimal oversight suddenly found themselves scrambling to implement new accountability measures and audit procedures. The message was clear: The era of unchecked police corruption was ending. Officer Tyrone Davis watched the verdict from the safety of his new assignment with the state police, where he had been transferred after his cooperation with the federal investigation. The decision to testify had cost him friendships and made him enemies within his former department. But seeing Hayes convicted vindicated his choice to speak out. Brian Stilinski's trial began 2 weeks later, and, unlike Hayes, he chose to accept a plea bargain rather than face the uncertainty of a jury trial. Standing before Judge Morrison, Stilinski formally acknowledged his guilt on charges of civil rights violations and obstruction of justice. "Mr. Stilinski," Judge Morrison said, her voice stern, "your attempt to arrest State Auditor Jackson was not just a momentary lapse in judgment. It was emblematic of a culture of prejudice and abuse that allowed corruption to flourish in your department. Your actions that morning demonstrated a fundamental contempt for the rule of law and the rights of the citizens you were sworn to protect." Stilinski mumbled an apology, but his words lacked conviction. He had been forced to confront the reality of his prejudices and their consequences. But there was little evidence that he truly understood the harm he had caused. The plea agreement called for Stilinski to serve 18 months in federal prison and to permanently forfeit his law enforcement certification. He would never again have the authority to carry a badge or a gun in service to the public. As the various trials and plea agreements concluded over the following months, the full scope of the corruption became clear. 37 defendants had been convicted or had pleaded guilty to federal charges. The total amount of money stolen exceeded $4 million, and the assets seized by the government would help compensate taxpayers for some of their losses. But the financial cost was only part of the damage. The corruption had undermined public trust in law enforcement and had allowed dangerous criminals to escape justice, while officers focused on enriching themselves rather than protecting the community. Zara Jackson found herself in high demand as a speaker at law enforcement conferences and government accountability seminars across the country. Her experience had become a case study in how systematic auditing could expose corruption and how one person's courage in the face of intimidation could lead to systemic change. The lesson from this experience, she would tell audiences, is that accountability is not automatic. It requires vigilance, courage, and a commitment to the principle that no one is above the law. When we allow corruption to flourish in the shadows, we betray the trust of the people we serve. The police department underwent a complete restructuring in the wake of the convictions. Lieutenant Foster, now Captain Foster, implemented new financial controls, mandatory ethics training, and regular auditing procedures. But rebuilding trust with the community would be a much longer process. Community meetings were held throughout the city, allowing residents to voice their concerns about police misconduct and to participate in discussions about reform. Many speakers expressed anger about the years of corruption that had gone undetected, but there was also cautious optimism about the possibility of building a better relationship between law enforcement and the communities they served. Kiana Smith, a local business owner who had been following the trials closely, spoke at one such meeting. "What happened in our police department was a betrayal of everything that law enforcement is supposed to represent. But the fact that these officers were caught and prosecuted shows that our system of justice can work when people are willing to stand up and do what's right." The trials had also revealed the crucial role that Officer Davis had played in exposing the corruption. Initially viewed with suspicion by some community members who saw him as complicit in the crimes, Davis gradually gained recognition as a whistleblower who had sacrificed his career to serve the public interest. Officer Davis could have stayed silent and continued to benefit from the corrupt system, Zara noted in one of her speeches. Instead, he chose to risk everything to ensure that justice was served. His courage made it possible to hold these criminals accountable. As winter turned to spring, The city began to move forward from the scandal that had consumed it for nearly a year. New officers were hired to replace those who had been convicted or had resigned in disgrace. Training programs were implemented to ensure that ethical standards were clearly understood and consistently enforced. But perhaps most importantly, the events had demonstrated that accountability was possible, even in the face of systematic corruption and institutional resistance. The confrontation on the Capitol steps that had seemed so outrageous and humiliating at the time had ultimately led to one of the most comprehensive corruption prosecutions in the state's history. Zara Jackson returned to her regular duties as state auditor, but her experience had reinforced her commitment to transparency and accountability in government. She knew that there were likely other agencies harboring similar corruption, other officials who believed themselves above scrutiny. The work would continue, one audit at a time, one investigation at a time, because in a democracy, the price of freedom was eternal vigilance, and the cost of corruption was measured not just in stolen money, but in the erosion of public trust and the betrayal of civic ideals. The reckoning had come for those who had abused their authority, and justice had been served. But the larger work of building accountable, ethical government would never be finished. It would require the continued efforts of people like Zara Jackson, Tyrone Davis, and countless others who understood that democracy depended on the willingness of ordinary citizens to stand up for what was right. 1 year after the dramatic confrontation on the Capitol steps, Zara Jackson stood once again in front of the imposing government building, but this time the circumstances were entirely different. She was there to receive the Public Service Excellence Award from the governor, recognition for her role in exposing one of the largest corruption scandals in the state's history. The ceremony drew hundreds of attendees, including law enforcement officials, government employees, and community leaders who wanted to show their support for accountability in public service. As Zara walked up the same steps where Brian Stilinski had tried to arrest her, she reflected on how dramatically things had changed. Governor Patricia Mills presented the award personally, speaking about the importance of ethical leadership and the courage required to challenge corruption wherever it existed. Zara Jackson's work represents the best of public service, the governor said. When faced with intimidation and threats, she remained committed to her duty to the taxpayers of this state. Her investigation not only recovered millions of stolen dollars but also restored faith in our system of accountability. In the audience, Captain Greg Foster watched with mixed emotions. The past year had been the most challenging of his career as he worked to rebuild a police department that had been devastated by corruption and scandal. Many good officers had chosen to transfer to other agencies rather than deal with the stigma associated with their former colleagues' crimes. But there had also been positive changes. The new oversight procedures had eliminated opportunities for financial fraud, and the department's relationship with the community was slowly improving. Crime rates had actually decreased as officers focused on legitimate law enforcement rather than personal enrichment schemes. Officer Tyrone Davis was also in attendance, now serving as a training instructor for the State Police Academy. His experience as a whistleblower had made him a valuable resource for teaching new recruits about ethics and the importance of reporting misconduct. Though his decision to cooperate with the investigation had initially made him a pariah among some law enforcement officers, he was gradually gaining recognition as someone who had put principle above personal loyalty. The hardest part, Davis would tell his students, wasn't testifying against people I had worked with for years. It was realizing that by staying silent for so long, I had enabled their criminal behavior. Every day I didn't speak up was another day that taxpayer money was stolen and public trust was eroded. The convicted officers were serving their sentences in various federal facilities across the country. Robert Hayes had been sentenced to 28 years in prison, effectively a life sentence for the 62-year-old former captain. His appeals had been unsuccessful, and he was facing the reality of spending his remaining years behind bars. Brian Stilinski was serving his 18-month sentence at a minimum security facility in South Carolina. The man who had once worn a police uniform with arrogance and prejudice now worked in the prison laundry, his law enforcement career a distant memory. His racist confrontation with Zara Jackson had become a case study in police academies across the country, used to illustrate how prejudice and abuse of authority could destroy careers and undermine public trust. The other convicted officers were scattered throughout the federal prison system, each serving sentences proportionate to their level of involvement in the corruption scheme. Some had shown genuine remorse for their actions, while others continued to maintain that they had been unfairly targeted by an overzealous prosecution. Vincent Kozlov, the contractor who had operated the shell companies, had served his reduced sentence and was now working as a consultant for the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, helping investigators understand how corruption schemes operate and how to detect them. His cooperation had been instrumental in recovering assets and understanding the full scope of the criminal enterprise. The financial impact of the corruption scandal extended far beyond the direct theft of public funds. The city had spent millions on legal fees, new oversight systems, and efforts to rebuild the police department. Insurance claims had been filed for some of the losses, but taxpayers ultimately bore the cost of their officials' criminal behavior. However, the recovered assets had provided some compensation. The government had seized and sold Hayes's boat, vacation home, and luxury vehicles, generating over $1 million that was returned to the city treasury. Bank accounts containing proceeds from the corruption had been frozen and confiscated, providing additional recovery. More importantly, the new oversight systems had already prevented additional corruption from occurring. Regular audits and financial controls had eliminated opportunities for the kinds of systematic theft that had flourished under the old system. The scandal had also prompted legislative changes at the state level. New laws required more frequent auditing of police department finances, mandated ethics training for all law enforcement officers, and established whistleblower protections for officers who reported misconduct. Community relationships had been more difficult to repair. Many residents remained skeptical of police motives and continued to view law enforcement with suspicion. Community policing initiatives had been expanded, but rebuilding trust was a slow process that would take years to complete. Some positive changes had emerged from the scandal. The police department's new leadership was more diverse and more committed to community engagement. Officers were required to participate in regular community meetings, and civilian oversight of police operations had been strengthened. Crime victims who had been ignored while officers focused on their corruption schemes were finally receiving the attention they deserved. Cold cases were being reopened and investigated properly, and the department's clearance rates for serious crimes had improved dramatically. As the award ceremony concluded, Zara was approached by several young government employees who wanted to express their admiration for her courage and professionalism. Many said that her example had inspired them to pursue careers in auditing and accountability. "You showed us that one person really can make a difference," said Amanda Rodriguez, a recent graduate who had just started working for the state comptroller's office. "When I face pressure to overlook problems or avoid difficult investigations, I think about what you went through, and it gives me strength to do the right thing." Zara was moved by the response from younger colleagues, understanding that her experience had become more than just a corruption investigation. It had become a symbol of what was possible when public servants remained committed to their oath of office. That evening, at a reception following the ceremony, Zara found herself in conversation with Detective Kiana Smith, an African-American officer who had joined the reformed police department 6 months earlier. Smith had heard about the scandal during her training and had specifically requested assignment to the department because she wanted to be part of the rebuilding effort. Jackson, I wanted to thank you personally, Smith said. When I heard about what happened to you on those steps and how you handled it, it inspired me to believe that the system could actually work for people who look like us. Zara nodded thoughtfully. The system only works when people are willing to make it work. What happened that morning could have been swept under the rug if enough people had been willing to look the other way. But too many people decided that accountability mattered more than comfort. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Marcus Webb, Brian Stilinski's former defense attorney, who had requested a private word with Zara. Webb had left criminal defense after the corruption trials, troubled by what he had learned about his clients during the proceedings. "Miss Jackson, I owe you an apology," Webb said quietly. "During the trial, I tried to portray what happened to you as a simple misunderstanding. But the more I learned about my clients and their attitudes, the more I realized that Stilinski's behavior that morning was exactly what it appeared to be, a manifestation of racism and abuse of power." Zara appreciated his honesty. "Mr. Webb, you were doing your job as a defense attorney. But I'm glad you've come to understand the broader implications of what we uncovered." Webb nodded grimly. "I've started doing pro bono work for police accountability organizations now. It's my way of trying to make amends for the role I played in defending the indefensible." The conversation highlighted how the scandal had affected not just those directly involved, but everyone who had come into contact with it. Lawyers, judges, city officials, and community members had all been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about corruption and prejudice in their institutions. 2 years after the initial confrontation, the transformed police department was operating under completely different principles than the organization that had been decimated by corruption. Captain Foster had implemented community policing programs that required officers to build relationships with residents rather than simply responding to calls for service. The department's new headquarters featured a public information office where citizens could access police records and budget information. A civilian oversight board met monthly to review complaints and examine department policies. Body cameras were mandatory for all patrol officers, and their footage was regularly reviewed for signs of misconduct. Most importantly, the culture had changed. New recruits were selected based on their commitment to ethical policing and community service. The old networks of corruption and cronyism had been dismantled, replaced by systems of accountability and transparency. Officer Tyrone Davis had become a national figure in law enforcement reform circles. His story of choosing principle over loyalty resonated with officers across the country who were struggling with similar ethical dilemmas. He spoke regularly at police academies and law enforcement conferences, sharing his experience and encouraging others to speak up when they witnessed misconduct. "The blue wall of silence isn't about protecting good cops," Davis would tell his audiences. "It's about protecting bad cops from the consequences of their actions. When we stay silent about corruption, we betray the oath we took to serve and protect." His message was particularly powerful because it came from someone who had lived the experience. Davis had paid a personal price for his decision to cooperate with the investigation, but he had also gained something more valuable: the knowledge that he had helped ensure justice was served. The Financial Crimes Unit of the FBI had used the corruption case as a model for investigating similar schemes in other jurisdictions. The techniques developed during the investigation had been shared with law enforcement agencies across the country, leading to corruption prosecutions in dozens of cities. Agent Rebecca Stone had been promoted to head the Bureau's Public Corruption Section, largely based on her success in the police department case. She credited Zara Jackson's thorough auditing work with providing the foundation for the entire investigation. Without Miss Jackson's initial findings, we never would have known where to look. Stone explained to a congressional committee examining police corruption. Her work demonstrates why independent oversight is so crucial for maintaining accountability in law enforcement. The academic community had also taken notice of the case. Criminal justice programs at universities across the country used the corruption scandal as a case study in their courses on police ethics and administration. Students analyzed the factors that had allowed the corruption to flourish and the mechanisms that had ultimately exposed it. Professor Janet Martinez at the State University's Criminal Justice Department assigned her students to write papers comparing the corruption case to similar scandals in other cities. This case is particularly valuable for study because it shows both how corruption develops and how it can be effectively combated, she explained to her class. The papers written by her students revealed sophisticated analysis of the systemic factors that had contributed to the corruption. Many identified the lack of independent oversight as a crucial vulnerability that had been exploited by the corrupt officers. Meanwhile, the convicted officers were serving their sentences and facing very different futures than they had anticipated when they first began stealing public money. Robert Hayes had filed multiple appeals, all of which had been unsuccessful. At 64 years old, he was facing the reality that he would likely die in prison. His wife had divorced him and moved to another state, unable to cope with the shame and financial ruin that had resulted from his crimes. Their children had distanced themselves from their father, embarrassed by his actions and the publicity they had generated. Brian Stilinski had been released from federal prison after serving his 18-month sentence, but his life had been permanently altered by his conviction. He was unable to find steady employment, as his criminal record made him unemployable in most fields. The racist confrontation with Zara Jackson, captured on dozens of cell phone cameras, had made him recognizable to people throughout the region. Stilinski had moved to a small town several hours away, where he worked intermittently at manual labor jobs that paid barely enough to cover his basic expenses. The comfortable middle-class lifestyle he had enjoyed as a police officer was gone forever, replaced by economic uncertainty and social isolation. Some of the other convicted officers had shown more genuine remorse for their actions. Officer Scott Murphy had participated in a restorative justice program while in prison, meeting with community members who had been harmed by police corruption. The experience had been transformative for him, helping him understand the real-world impact of his crimes. "I thought I was just taking money that nobody would miss," Murphy had said during one of these meetings. "But I realize now that every dollar I stole was money that could have been used for schools, roads, or other services that people needed. I stole from my own community, from my own neighbors." Murphy had been released after serving his sentence and was now working with a nonprofit organization that provided job training for formerly incarcerated individuals. His first-hand experience with the justice system had given him unique insights into the challenges faced by people trying to rebuild their lives after conviction. The nonprofit's director, Maria Santos, valued Murphy's contribution to their program. "Scott brings a perspective that our other counselors don't have. He understands what it's like to lose everything because of poor choices, and he's committed to helping others avoid the same mistakes." But not all of the convicted officers had shown similar growth. Several continued to maintain their innocence despite overwhelming evidence of their guilt. They blamed their convictions on political pressure and claimed they had been unfairly targeted for following practices that had been acceptable in the past. These unrepentant individuals found some support among family members and a few former colleagues who believed they had been scapegoated, but their voices became increasingly marginalized as the reformed police department demonstrated that ethical law enforcement was not only possible, but more effective than the corrupt practices of the past. The city's crime statistics supported this conclusion, despite the initial disruption caused by the mass arrests and resignations. Crime rates had steadily decreased as the department focused on legitimate law enforcement rather than personal enrichment. Community cooperation with police investigations had increased dramatically as residents began to trust that officers were working in their interest rather than against them. Zara Jackson continued her work as state auditor, but she had expanded her focus to include proactive education about accountability in government. She spoke regularly at conferences and wrote articles for professional journals about the techniques that could be used to detect and prevent corruption. Her experience had taught her that corruption thrived in environments where oversight was weak and where officials believed they were immune from scrutiny. The solution was not just better auditing techniques, but a culture that expected transparency and demanded accountability from public servants. Corruption is like a cancer, Zara would explain to audiences. If you wait until the symptoms are obvious, it may be too late to save the patient. The key is regular checkups and early detection. The metaphor resonated with government officials who understood that prevention was more effective than prosecution when it came to protecting public resources and maintaining public trust. As the second anniversary of the Capitol Steps confrontation approached, local media began preparing retrospective pieces about the scandal and its aftermath. Reporters interviewed community members, reformed police officers, and government officials about how the events had changed their city. The overwhelming consensus was that the painful process of exposing and prosecuting the corruption had ultimately strengthened the community. Trust in government had been severely damaged, but it was gradually being rebuilt through consistent ethical behavior and transparent operations. One particularly poignant interview was with elderly resident Dorothy Williams, whose neighborhood had suffered from neglect while police officers focused on their corruption schemes rather than community safety. For years, we called the police about drug dealers and break-ins, but nothing ever seemed to get done, Williams recalled. We thought they just didn't care about our neighborhood. Now we know they were too busy stealing from us to bother protecting us. But Williams also noted positive changes since the department's reform. The new officers actually patrol our streets and respond when we call. My grandchildren can play outside again without me worrying about their safety. It's like we finally have real police protection instead of just uniforms walking around. Her comments reflected a broader transformation in police-community relations that had resulted from the scandal and subsequent reforms. The crisis had forced both sides to reevaluate their relationship and work toward building something better than what had existed before. As spring arrived and flowers began to bloom around the state capitol building, Zara Jackson occasionally walked past the steps where her confrontation with Brian Stilinski had taken place. The spot held no particular significance for her now. It was simply part of the building where she worked every day. But she understood that for many people, those steps had become a symbol of the possibility of accountability in government. They represented the idea that no one, regardless of their position or authority, was above the law, and that ordinary citizens had both the right and the responsibility to demand ethical behavior from their public servants. 5 years had passed since the morning when Brian Stilinski had attempted to arrest Zara Jackson on the Capitol steps, and the ripple effects of that confrontation continued to spread throughout the state and beyond. What had begun as a routine audit had evolved into a national model for police accountability and government transparency. The police department that had once been synonymous with corruption had become a showcase for ethical law enforcement. Officers from around the country visited to study the reforms that had been implemented, and the department's leadership regularly spoke at conferences about the transformation process. Captain Greg Foster, now nearing retirement, reflected on the changes he had witnessed. 5 years ago, I was embarrassed to wear this uniform. Today, I'm proud to represent an organization that puts service above self-interest and accountability above convenience. The department had not just eliminated corruption, it had become a leader in community-oriented policing, Crime rates had declined significantly, community trust had been rebuilt, and officer morale was higher than it had been in decades. The transformation demonstrated that ethical policing was not just morally superior to corruption, it was also more effective at achieving law enforcement's core mission of protecting public safety. Officer Tyrone Davis had left the state police to establish a consulting firm that specialized in helping law enforcement agencies identify and eliminate corruption. His unique perspective as both a whistleblower and a career officer made him a valuable resource for departments struggling with ethical issues. The hardest part isn't identifying the corruption, Davis would tell his clients. It's changing the culture that allowed it to flourish. That requires leadership from the top, accountability at every level, and a willingness to put principle above personal loyalty. Firm had worked with police departments in 17 states, helping them implement oversight systems and training programs designed to prevent the kinds of systematic corruption that had once plagued his own agency. The success of these interventions had made Davis a sought-after expert in police reform circles. Zara Jackson had been re-elected as state auditor twice since the corruption investigation, running unopposed both times. Her reputation for thorough, impartial auditing had made her one of the most respected officials in state government. But more importantly, her example had inspired a new generation of public servants who viewed accountability as central to their mission. The auditing procedures she had developed during the police corruption investigation had been adopted by government agencies across the country. The Jackson Protocol, as it came to be known, provided a systematic approach to 1. Detecting financial irregularities and identifying potential corruption before it could become entrenched. Sunlight is the best disinfectant, Zara would remind audiences, quoting Justice Louis Brandeis. When public officials know their actions will be scrutinized, they're much more likely to act with integrity. The success of her methods had led to invitations to speak at international conferences on government accountability. Delegations from developing countries had visited her office to learn about techniques for combating corruption in their own institutions. But perhaps the most significant impact of the corruption scandal was the way it had changed public expectations about government accountability. Citizens who had once accepted official misconduct as inevitable now demanded transparency and ethical behavior from their elected and appointed officials. Community organizations had formed to monitor government spending and police conduct. Regular citizens attended city council meetings and school board sessions, asking probing questions about budget decisions and policy changes. The passive acceptance of official misconduct had been replaced by active engagement in government oversight. This increased scrutiny had made some officials uncomfortable, but it had also led to better governance. Elected officials who might have been tempted to engage in questionable practices now knew that their actions would be closely watched and that misconduct would be exposed and punished. The legal system had also been strengthened by the corruption prosecutions. Federal prosecutors had developed new expertise in complex financial crimes, and state courts had established precedents that made it easier to prosecute official misconduct. The deterrent effect of these successful prosecutions had been felt throughout the law enforcement community. Judge Patricia Morrison, who had presided over many of the corruption trials, noted the change in her courtroom. "We used to see police officers as witnesses who were automatically credible. The corruption scandal reminded everyone that wearing a badge doesn't make someone immune to the temptation to break the law." The scandal had also prompted legislative changes that strengthened government accountability. New laws required more frequent financial audits, established stronger whistleblower protections, and imposed harsher penalties for official corruption. These reforms created additional safeguards against the kinds of systematic misconduct that had been exposed in the police department. State Senator Lisa Chen, who had authored much of the reform legislation, credited Zara Jackson's investigation with creating the political momentum necessary for change. Before the police scandal, it was difficult to get my colleagues interested in accountability measures. Afterward, everyone wanted to be seen as supporting transparency and ethical government. The educational impact of the case continued to grow as well. Criminal justice programs at universities throughout the region required students to study the corruption scandal and its aftermath. Many graduates entered law enforcement careers with a deeper understanding of ethical issues and a commitment to preventing the kinds of misconduct they had studied. Professor Janet Martinez had expanded her research into police corruption, using the local scandal as the foundation for a comprehensive study of corruption patterns in law enforcement agencies across the country. Her work had identified common warning signs that could help agencies detect problems before they became widespread. The corruption didn't happen overnight, Martinez explained in her research. It developed gradually as small ethical compromises accumulated into major criminal behavior. The key to prevention is recognizing and addressing these early warning signs before they metastasize. Her findings had been incorporated into training programs for police supervisors and had influenced federal oversight policies for law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding. As the 5th anniversary of the Capitol Steps confrontation approached, local media once again prepared retrospective coverage of the scandal and its lasting impact. But the tone of these stories was markedly different from the crisis coverage of 5 years earlier. Instead of focusing on the crimes that had been committed, reporters highlighted the positive changes that had resulted from their exposure. The reformed police department, the strengthened accountability systems, and the increased civic engagement were all cited as evidence that democracy could self-correct when citizens demanded ethical governance. Brian Stilinski had faded into obscurity, working odd jobs in a small town where few people knew about his past. He had never publicly acknowledged the racist nature of his confrontation with Zara Jackson, and he remained bitter about his conviction and the loss of his law enforcement career. But his former colleagues who had genuinely embraced reform viewed his unrepentant attitude as a reminder of the toxic culture they had worked so hard to change. Officer Scott Murphy, now working with formerly incarcerated individuals, occasionally used Stilinski as an example of how refusing to accept responsibility could prevent personal growth and redemption. "Brian represents the old way of thinking," Murphy would explain to his clients. "He's stuck in the past because he won't admit that his behavior was wrong. The only way to move forward is to take responsibility for your actions and commit to doing better." Robert Hayes had died in federal prison 2 years earlier, his appeals exhausted and his health broken by the stress of incarceration. His death had barely been mentioned in local media, a stark contrast to the prominent coverage his arrest had received 5 years earlier. The other convicted officers had served their sentences and were slowly rebuilding their lives, with varying degrees of success, depending on their willingness to accept responsibility for their actions and make amends to their community. Vincent Kozlov had completed his cooperation with federal investigators and had started a legitimate consulting business, helping small companies navigate government contracting procedures. His first-hand knowledge of how corruption operated made him valuable to businesses that wanted to ensure their dealings with government agencies were completely above board. As Zara Jackson prepared for another day of auditing government finances and ensuring accountability in public spending, she reflected on how much had changed since that morning when an arrogant police officer had tried to arrest her for the crime of being a successful black woman in a position of authority. The confrontation that had seemed so humiliating and infuriating at the time had ultimately led to one of the most comprehensive corruption investigations in the state's history. It had demonstrated that accountability was possible, that justice could prevail, and that one person's courage in the face of intimidation could catalyze systemic change. But Zara also understood that the work was never finished. Corruption was like rust, it would return if vigilance was relaxed. New officials would take office, new opportunities for misconduct would arise, and new challenges to accountability would emerge. The price of democracy was eternal vigilance, and that vigilance had to be exercised by ordinary citizens who understood that their government belonged to them, not to the officials who temporarily wielded power on their behalf. As she walked up the Capitol steps that morning, passing the spot where Brian Stilinski had once tried to assert his illegitimate authority over her, Zara Jackson carried with her the knowledge that the system could work when people were willing to make it work. The confrontation was over, the criminals had been punished, and justice had been served. But the larger mission continued, one audit at a time, one investigation at a time, ensuring that those entrusted with public authority remained worthy of the public trust. In the end, that was what mattered, not the individual victories or defeats, but the ongoing commitment to the principle that, in a democracy, no one was above the law and everyone was accountable to the people they served. The legacy of that morning on the Capitol steps would live on in the reformed institutions, the strengthened safeguards, and the elevated expectations of citizens who had learned that they had both the right and the responsibility to demand better from their government. And in a small but significant way, democracy had been strengthened by a racist police officer's attempt to arrest a state auditor who refused to be intimidated. Sometimes justice came from the most unlikely sources, and progress emerged from the most challenging confrontations. The story was complete, but the mission continued.